Right, now this is basically a very simplistic view on the planning system, our planning process. I wasn't aware of how many or who the people were that were coming, so I hadn't expected people with quite as much expertise as there is, but hopefully there's something in it for everybody. I've taken it in three stages, starting at the top level, the government level, and then working through the GLA down to local level. And of course, the government sets the legislation, and going back to 1947, the Town and Country Planning Act is what has ruled the planning system since then. And every government comes along and tinkers with it. And we've now reached the stage where it's a mess. So I don't have any objection to a government trying to sort the mess out. The question is, are they going to be sorting it out the right way? But that's a question for discussion later. On the front of the white paper consultation, the Minister has said that an overhaul of the country's outdated planning system that will deliver high quality sustainable homes communities will need to be at the heart of the most significant reforms to housing policy in decades. And then they go on, the landmark changes will transform a system that had long been criticised for being too sluggish in providing houses, etc. Now, I don't think too many people would agree that the planning system doesn't work because it doesn't suit anybody. And a system that's not suiting anybody can't be working, properly. So it is definitely time for a root and branch change of the system. But as I say, whether this is the right way, who knows? At the moment, and after the white paper or the law is changed and the white paper has gone through, there'll still be the national planning policy framework. So all the policies will come from the government. So that in itself does limit what you can do locally. And that is the place where the bulk of the policies are created. And this is what works its way down through the various stages of the planning system. It provides a framework with which the locally prepared plans for housing and other developments can be produced. The planning law requires that applications for planning permission be determined in accordance with the development plan, and the national planning framework must be taken into account in preparing the development plan and is a material consideration in planning decisions. If you go along to planning meetings, they're often committee meetings, they're often say, oh, that is not a consideration in planning terms. And what you think is vitally important to you is irrelevant as far as the planning process is concerned. So that's an issue in itself. The decisions fairly recently, Councillor Terry was saying at the Homebase meeting that the presumption in favour of sustainable development has actually been written into the rules governing planning. So when the planning committee meets, it has to assume in favour of granting planning permission for development, and only in extreme situation can it refuse. So that's one of the problems we have these days. I've given up going to the planning committee because it's just a rubber stamping organisation, and I was blaming the councillors. I hadn't realised that actually it's coming from the top and they don't really have much option but to do what they're told from the top. And I've heard plenty of stories saying the government will take away the planning responsibility for local authorities. Bromley is one where they've not played the ball, not given enough land for housing, and they're being threatened to have their planning system, or their planning department taken away from them. So there is a real threat there. I think we could argue that Waltham Forest perhaps goes the other way, but we'll come on to that later on. So once the government sets the rules, and as I say, there's a white paper going through where the whole system is going to change, the regional one in our case is developed by the GLA and the Mayor. So when the Mayor Khan came in, the first thing they did was to start work on revising the London plan. So that was in December 2017. I went along to the launch of the meeting, was horrified to hear what they were planning, which was basically, if you take a garage that was used as an example, at the moment it just provides a very few jobs and doesn't use the land very effectively. What they wanted to see was that taken away, a block of 10-storey block put in its place. You could leave the petrol station or whatever on the ground, or shops. You could have offices on the next few floors and residential above it. And you're beginning to see that coming through now, where you get what you thought was a perfectly sound business actually selling up so that the land can be used more effectively, and whether that business finds a slot in the new development depends on the particular development. So at the moment, we were in an interesting situation with the London plan because it had gone through all the inquiry process and all the rest of it. And it had got to the point where it was ready to be published. And it has to go to the Secretary of State for approval. So again, you can see the government is controlling the planning process, lock, stock and barrel. And in this case, the Secretary of State turned round to the Mayor, or wrote to the Mayor, to be more accurate, saying, having considered your plan at length, my conclusion is that the necessary decisions to bring more land into the planning system have not been taken. The added complexity will reduce appetite for development further and slow down the system. And throughout the plan, you have directly contradicted national policy. As you know, by law, you must have regard to the need for your strategies to be consistent with national policies. And the other thing that the Planning Inspectorate reported on was that the revised London plan was proposing 66,000 new homes a year. But the Planning Inspectorate says, well, they've only put up land adequate for 52,000. So there's some fundamental dispute going on between the Mayor and the government, but that appears, listening to the news tonight, appears to be on COVID and anything else you can mention. I think somebody said it might be an election next year, but maybe that's irrelevant. But what it's doing, of course, is holding up the new London plan, because the Mayor wrote back, and this was in April. Whilst I've instructed my officials to engage positively and constructively, I'm hopeful that a former wording we will all find acceptable can be found, as it would be hard for me to propose publishing my plan if I believe this would be detrimental to the needs of London. And there is nothing else on the website, on the GLA website, to say what's happened next. So one assumes that the officers are still negotiating with the Planning Inspectorate, and I've not heard any more what's going on. But what it means is that the new London plan has been held up. Now, a lot of talk is given on targets, and I've realised that that's a complex issue as well, because you have to be sure you're comparing eggs with eggs, because some targets they talk about over different periods of time. So you've got to be careful that the figures you're looking at are for comparable amounts of time. And I'm realizing that some of the figures I had were not quite accurate, because I'm looking at a different timescale to what I thought they were. But the SHMA says that London needs to build over 1.6 million homes between 2016 and 2041, which is 65,800 per year, which is similar to the figure we were just talking about. 42,000 of those need to be affordable. Now, I thought I'd put a slide up about affordable social housing and rent and all the rest of it, but it's such a complex world. I thought, I don't think I even understand it, let alone be able to put a slide together. So I've left that out. So if you want to understand the difference between affordable and rent and all the rest of it, you'll have to go and do your own research, because you'll find it's a complete minefield. So that's where we are with the GLA. Now, what I thought we'd do is just look at the overall process. Now, I think most of you, as I said earlier, will know as much about this as I do, but it's no harm in going over it, and some people might pick something useful up out of it. As I've already said, you start off with the government policies. That then drives what the Mayor can put into the London plan. So the draft London plan was based on the policies that were around at the time. Once that's published, then Waltham Forest has to produce a local plan. And one of the problems is if that's delayed, obviously that impacts on here. So there's a mismatch in dates and policies, and it all gets very complicated. But what's just come out, and I'll talk about it a bit more in a moment, is the local plan, or the update on the local plan. But there is obviously an existing local plan. So at the moment, when a planning application comes in, the planning officer's role is to look at the planning application and make sure it ticks all the boxes in the local plan. And if you take the home-based one as a good example, there's something like 200 files on the planning application. and as far as I could see, they all tick all the policies the council's got. So it then becomes quite difficult to actually oppose it. So once the planning officer has done his check, he then writes a report, which then goes to the planning committee. I should just just put to one side that actually the majority of planning apps are approved by delegated authority. So an extension to a house and so forth doesn't usually come to the planning committee. Only the larger, more controversial ones, and anything to do with council-owned land comes to the planning committee. The smaller ones are all dealt with by delegated authority. So we get the larger ones coming to the planning committee. That's made up of 4 Labour councillors and 1 Tory. And as you no doubt know, Jenny Gray is the chair of that committee. And it's their role to study the planning officer's report, listen to the objectors, and listen to the people who speak in favour of an application, because you get the developers speaking as well. And as you well know, you get your 3 minutes and not a minute more. And then they come to a conclusion. Well, I've now been around doing this for so long that I can guarantee that every planning application that comes to them is approved. And now I've realised why, because of the way the law has been written, that they don't have much option but to say they approve it. So we then get to this point where it's approved, the developer can then go off and do what he said he was going to do. If it's rejected, usually what happens is that the developer then objects and says, no, you shouldn't have rejected my scheme. He then can appeal to the planning inspector, and then they have the power to call an inquiry. They can either do it in a written form or even a public inquiry. Really big controversial ones sometimes come to a proper public inquiry, but that's expensive and nobody ever wants to go down that route. So now, because they have the obligation to approve a scheme unless it's really wrong, then you don't get too many going off to appeal. And of course, the GLA has its own planning officers, and they're doing a similar thing at the regional level. So that's how the system works. Looking now at Waltham Forest, they started on the local plan revision a year or so back. And earlier in the year, you may remember if you went along to any of the meetings, they produced a map on the desks and said, you know, where could we develop? And they'd already identified sites they could develop. So they were less than honest, let's say. They were being definitely trying to push us towards approving the sites they had already identified. And I think they were also looking for any that they'd missed. And I think part of the exercise was to establish what sort of opposition there'd be to certain sites, but then I'm a cynic, so who knows. So the next stage was to consult the public, but they decided that to do it all as one document was getting a bit out of hand, and they said that public comment was taken on board and they've split it up. And to be fair, that's going to make life a lot easier, because now we can just look at the sites as opposed to the policies. Now, the policies one doesn't come out till the 26th of October, so we've got a little while to go before we see that. The site allocations one, there's no doubt you'll know, is already out, and it's got the targets in there, and what it's trying to do is to identify the land to meet the targets. Now, starting in 2012, you can see that the annual target we had was 760, went up to 862, and then it shot up to 1,264, and that's where that figure comes from. So the next 10 years, we're expected to produce 12,640 more homes over that 10-year period. And I've written to the head of development control, the director of development control, to try and understand how these targets work. At which point is a home finished and that bit of the target is taken? Is it done on an annual basis? Is it done over 10 years or what? So far I haven't had a response, but that will be interesting if I get a clarification on it. I've tried to dig around on the internet, but it does look a bit of a grey area. Now, the sites that they've listed, as you already know, there's something like 65 of them. The ones I've done in green are ones that we're well aware of where they are with the planning issues. A lot of these are already been started. They've gone to planning application. Highlands Road, they're just getting up to the first floor now. The Mall has just come out as a brand new planning application. So I'm not entirely clear how these sites are going to provide the target for the next up till 2035 when they're already underway, which should mean that they're already the last target. So again, this is where I'm not really clear. One thing I did spot, partly because I live near Wood Street Station, is they were saying they've got 15 flats on Wood Street Station. I'm still trying to dig out how that's going to be possible, so that will probably be an objection from me. And as you know, the Whitcross or Barts Health Trust is wanting to build a new hospital, and help fund it, they will sell off quite a lot of land, and they're talking about 1,500 flats on that site. And it seems to me that we've got more than enough land for actually achieving this target. But from what the officers are saying, we can only achieve 19,000. So we're going to be short of quite a bit. And if we're forced to create additional flats, how's it going to be done? So that's a question that hangs in the air. Those sites are not just sort of picked off by sticking a pin in the map or anything. There's been, I presume, consultants brought in to do a skyline study, and they've studied all the possible sites and done a critique of them, and you get a lot of detail here and various other information on the map and so on. Interestingly enough, I was reading the draft white paper, and they want to go all digital. And they're saying that it would be easier for people to understand maps and drawings, which is perfectly true. And I have a feeling that in the future, we will be able to go online, see a possible development, see something like that, and we'll be able to tweak from any direction and see how it looks, because the home base one has got all sorts of views of looking very realistic of what the final site will look like. So that gives you a flavour of what the new planning process will be about. It will be done in this way. But coming back to where we are at the moment, the council has this consultation portal. For years it's been called the Limehouse one. For some odd reason it's on a Limehouse server, whatever that might mean. But I noticed that the actual web address now is still has got Waltham Forest in it rather than Limehouse. But basically, wherever they want to do consultation, they put it on this site. And at the moment, the site allocation one's there. So if you click on that, you can work through each site, put your comments in, and it's quite a neat, tidy way of doing it. Saves you having to write letters and get involved with emails and so forth. How well it's listened to and so forth, who knows. For those of you that are not aware, there's a weekly list of planning applications published. And that gives you a brief, so it gives you the planning number and a brief synopsis of what the application is. And you also get a list of the decisions that the officers and the planning committee have made. You can also search under various fields, but the easiest one is if you've got the planning application number, you just put that in and all the detail comes up like that. There's the Mall one, it gives you a brief synopsis of what is being planned. And it tells you who the planning officer is. So if you need to try and get hold of them, there's the person that is dealing with that one, and his responsibility will be to write the report on whether or not this scheme complies with all the policies. There's a whole lot wrong with this website and so forth, but I tell people who complain about it, I said, well, it's an awful lot better than it used to be. It used not to even work properly. So at least now it's working, and it can take these very large developments, because when the original Mall one came out, it couldn't cope with all the fuss. So they had to put it on the Limehouse one to be able to enable people to access it. So it has improved a lot, but to be fair, it's got a long way to go. One little tip, despite having done this for donkey's years, I only discovered it this time. If you go up here to the sort file and sort it into title ascending, you end up getting all the files that are in the correct order. Whereas before they were all over the place and you couldn't work it out. The design and access statement is the vital one because that sums up the whole scheme. And in the days when it was printed, it was just one big thick booklet and it was dead easy to go through it and see what was what. Now they break it down, and I don't ask me how they break it down, it's pretty random. I don't even know if a human does it or a robot, but it gets to the point where, well, there's that much in the memory, right, we'll move on to the next one. It doesn't break at natural break points or anything, so you have to go through it still. Oh, and that's moving on. What I was going to say is that when the local plan is being developed, it's vital we interface with it, because that is what the result is if we don't follow it through. I sat with Katie Andrews donkeys years ago on the northern fringe, northern Olympic fringe, and the planning officer was saying, yeah, we're going to develop round Lea Bridge and we're going to build high. And we were horrified. No, you can't do that. That's ridiculous and nonsense. You can't get down Lea Bridge Road, all the usual stories. And then we just moved on to other things, and the Olympics was a history and all the rest of it. And next minute, we discovered the motion has got planning permission, and lo and behold, here's what. And Claire can tell you far better than I can the other horrors that are going on in this area. But if we'd been able to control the local plan properly, we probably would have been able to stop that. But again, as I said at the very beginning, it's all down to what the government will allow us to do. And I mentioned earlier on that the home base site had got some good graphics. There's a good example. In the old days, you'd have to have a model made, and they were so expensive, they rarely did it. Now, with a good CGI company, they can knock that up in no time. And you can see exactly the impact the home base development is going to have. There's Wood Street Library, and that'll be the view from the library. Just a quick bit of advertising to say that Forest Road has been supporting my talks on the changing scene in Waltham Forest. So if you want to, I've done 3 and there's another one to come, and I'll probably do another one after that. I've been looking at various parts of the borough and how they've changed over the years, and their server has got those presentations sitting there, and I'll probably put this one on there as well, or if you've got it on YouTube, then I can just refer to it on YouTube. And just a plug for Action for Whips, that has just been set up, that group, and it wants to lobby Barts to ensure that we get the best hospital and the best use of the land. Right, I've finished, so you can now